The Eternal Dominion hung in the void like a monument to arrogance, which was precisely what it was designed to be. Measuring 47 kilometers from bow to stern, the Wyveridian Emperor's personal flagship didn't just dominate space, it insulted it. Every plate of its hull was forged from compressed neutronium alloy, a material so dense that most civilizations used it exclusively for their most critical infrastructure. The Wyveridians used it for their emperor's guest bathroom. For 312 years, the ship had served as the mobile throne of the Iridian Empire, drifting through the galaxy like an overfunded reminder that some species had entirely too much time and resources on their hands. Its shield arrays could deflect a small supernova. Its point defense network could track and eliminate 17,000 individual targets simultaneously. Its security protocols were written by the collective mind of Hexaron 9, a hive intelligence that spent 6 centuries doing literally nothing but thinking about how to keep things secure. The collective mind had gone insane from boredom after completing the project, which most species considered a reasonable price for perfection. Military academies across 47 star systems taught entire courses on why the Eternal Dominion represented an insurmountable defensive position. Strategists used it as the ultimate thought experiment. Given infinite resources and preparation time, how would you breach it? The correct answer, according to every accredited institution, was you wouldn't, because you're not an idiot. Which brought us to the humans sitting in the corner booth of the Fractured Comet, a bar that catered to the sort of individuals who made their living in the gray spaces between legal and suicidal. The human went by Gage, probably not a birth name, but then again most humans seemed to treat their original names as rough drafts anyway. Gage was lean, somewhere in the 3rd decade of a human lifespan, with the kind of eyes that suggested too many close calls and not nearly enough lessons learned from them. Those eyes currently watched a Draxian mercenary holding court at the bar, regaling a mixed crowd with tales of theoretical impossibility. The Emperor's ship, the Draxian was saying, his forearms gesturing dramatically enough to endanger nearby drinks, represents the pinnacle of defensive architecture. Even discussing infiltration is absurd. You would need to bypass quantum-locked teleportation inhibitors, gravitational shear fields, a scanning network that can detect foreign bacteria, and approximately 9,000 armed guards who are individually selected from it. Sounds boring, Gage said. The bar didn't exactly fall silent. It was too professional an establishment for such dramatic nonsense. But the conversation definitely stumbled. The Draxian's third eye swiveled to focus on the human while his other 2 remained fixed on his original audience. A neat trick of his species' physiology. Excuse me, I said it sounds boring. Gage took a sip of something that was technically classified as a beverage, though most species considered it closer to industrial solvent. 9,000 guards, quantum locks, that's just redundancy theater. Nobody actually builds something that's secure unless they're compensating for something. A heavily an information broker 2 tables over made a chittering sound that translated roughly to, "Oh, this should be good." She wasn't wrong. Nothing livened up a slow evening quite like watching someone talk themselves into a corner. The Draxian pivoted fully, which involved rotating his torso in a way that would have hospitalized most vertebrates. "You're suggesting the Eternal Dominion is vulnerable." "I'm suggesting," Gage said, leaning back in the booth with the casual confidence of someone who had either thought this through or hadn't thought at all, "that anything designed by a committee of paranoiacs is going to have problems. They're so busy thinking about every possible threat that they forget about the impossible ones." "The impossible ones," the Draxian repeated, his voice flat. "Humans have a saying, better lucky than good. You want to know what beats perfect security? Someone too stupid to realize it's perfect." Now the bar did quiet down. Even the automated bartender paused its mixing cycle, which was unusual because it literally didn't have the capacity for curiosity. Someone must have hit the listen to this override. The Draxian's mandibles clicked together in what might have been amusement, or might have been the prelude to violence. "You're claiming you could breach the Eternal Dominion. I'm claiming it's not as impossible as everyone seems to think." "Very well." The Draxian reached into his jacket and produced a credit chip, which he slapped onto Gage's table with enough force to make it bounce. 50,000 galactic credits says you can't even get past the outer perimeter drones before being reduced to your component atom. Gage looked at the chip, then at the Draxian, then at the rest of the bar's patrons, who were now watching with the intensity of spectators at a bloodsport match. This was the moment where a rational being would clarify that they'd been speaking hypothetically, Perhaps make a joke about human humor being an acquired taste, and gracefully exit the conversation. Make it 100,000, Gage said, and I'll bring you back something from the Emperor's personal quarters to prove I was there. The Havilian information broker's chittering intensified. This was going to be the best story she'd filed in months, regardless of how it ended. Though given human survival statistics, she was already mentally composing the eulogy. The Draxian's mandibles spread in what his species considered a smile, which most other species considered nightmare fuel. You understand what you're proposing. The Emperor's personal quarter. That's not just breaching the ship. That's penetrating to its most secure section. I'm aware of basic spatial relationships. You have one standard month. I'll need 2 weeks. The bet's parameters are 1 month. I heard you. I said I'll need 2 weeks. Gage finished the drink and stood, pocketing the credit chip, which means I'll spend the other half of the month trying to figure out what to do with your money. The human walked out of the fractured comet with the kind of swagger that suggested either supreme confidence or a traumatic head injury. Behind them, the bar erupted into conversation, with most patrons immediately placing their own side bets on how the human would die. Vaporization was the favorite at 3-to-1 odds, followed by spatial compression at 5-to-1, and explosive decompression at 8-to-1. One optimistic Flanarian put money on death by embarrassment, after failing to even locate the ship, which was considered the long-shot option. The Draxian returned to his drink, already composing the story he'd tell about the delusional human who'd essentially purchased their own death. It would be a good story. Humans always made good stories, right up until they made good cautionary tales. What none of them knew, what none of them could have predicted, because it would have required understanding the particular flavor of insanity that humanity had introduced to the galactic community, was that Gage was already running calculations, not the standard military assessment calculations that any proper infiltration specialist would use. No, these were the kind of calculations that started with what would nobody possibly expect and worked backward from there. The Eternal Dominion was designed to repel any conceivable threat, which meant Gage's job was very simple: be inconceivable. As the human disappeared into the station's crowded corridors, a small smile played across their face. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Weveridian Emperor slept peacefully aboard his floating fortress, completely unaware that he'd just become the universe's most expensive learning experience. The thing about untouchable targets, Gage thought while flagging down transport to the equipment district, is that untouchable is just another word for nobody's bothered yet. Time to bother. Planning to infiltrate the most secure vessel in known space required a certain mindset, and Gage had cultivated that mindset through years of making terrible decisions that somehow worked out. The key, as with most impossible tasks, was to avoid thinking about it too hard. The moment you started respecting the problem started respecting itself, and then you were both just standing around being polite while nothing got accomplished. The equipment list started simple: 1 recalibrated transport pod, the kind used for waste management between stations. Nothing said ignore me quite like a container full of garbage. Gage purchased one from a Belveri scrapper, who asked exactly 0 questions, which was the correct number of questions for this sort of transaction. Next came the sensor spoofing suite, cobbled together from civilian navigation equipment, and a quantum entanglement communicator that had been reported stolen from a research facility 3 years ago. The beauty of advanced technology was that it all used the same basic principles. You just had to convince it to use those principles backward. The spoofing suite wouldn't hold up to dedicated scanning, but dedicated scanning required someone to care enough to scan, which brought Gage to the philosophical cornerstone of the entire operation. Nobody expects garbage. The Eternal Dominion generated waste. Tremendous amounts of it, actually, because apparently housing 9,000 guards plus the Emperor's court, plus a small city's worth of support staff, meant dealing with a small city's worth of biological byproducts. That waste went somewhere, and somewhere meant waste processing contractors, and contractors meant scheduled pickups, and scheduled pickups meant predictable patterns that nobody monitored, because who in their right mind would hide in literal garbage to infiltrate anything? Humans. Apparently, humans would absolutely do that. Gage spent 3 days tracking waste management schedules, which involved bribing a dock administrator who seemed more confused by the request than suspicious of it. The Eternal Dominion contracted with Hexarian Sanitation Services, a corporation so monumentally boring that its existence actively repelled attention. The forged credentials took another day, mostly spent convincing a document specialist that yes, this was really happening, and no, explaining why was not part of the transaction. The credentials identified the waste pod as HSS 4719, scheduled for a routine collection from the ship's lower processing decks. The forgery was good enough to fool automated systems, which was all it needed to do. Automated systems didn't have intuition, didn't have suspicion, didn't have the capacity to think, wait, this seems weird. They just checked boxes. Proper ID code. Check. Scheduled pickup window. Check. Transponder signature. Check. Welcome aboard, please proceed to the waste reclamation port. The actual approach began on a Tuesday, which was a human unit of time measurement that meant absolutely nothing to the Viridian Empire but somehow felt appropriate. Gage launched the modified waste pod from a civilian station 17,000 kilometers from where the Eternal Dominion currently hung in geostationary orbit above Viridian Prime. The pod's trajectory was perfectly ordinary, exactly matching the acceleration profile of every other waste collection that day. Inside the pod, surrounded by sealed containers of actual waste, because committing to the bit was important, Gage monitored the approach on a display screen barely larger than a human hand. The Eternal Dominion grew from a glinting speck to a massive wall of metal that blotted out the star. Its point defense network tracked the pod, because the point defense network tracked everything, but tracking wasn't the same as caring. The weapons remained dormant. The pod was expected. The pod was scheduled. The pod was boring. Boring was beautiful. The outer perimeter drones gave the pod a cursory sensor sweep, checking for weapons signatures, unusual power readings, anything that suggested hostile intent. They found garbage, actual garbage in the containers, and one human life sign that registered as a waste management technician, because the spoofing suite was feeding them exactly what their programming expected to see. The drones logged the encounter and moved on, because garbage collectors weren't a threat, and if your security system started flagging garbage collectors, you'd spend all day responding to false positives. The first shield layer parted automatically, recognizing the authenticated credential, then the second layer, then the third. Each one was capable of withstanding sustained bombardment from capital ship weapons. Each one opened like a door for an expected guest, because that's what good security did. It kept out threats while allowing legitimate traffic through, and the pod's credentials said it was legitimate. Gage couldn't help grinning. Somewhere, probably in multiple military academies, instructors were teaching cadets about the impossibility of breaching the Eternal Dominion's defenses. They were running simulations, calculating force requirements, discussing theoretical attack vectors that would require fleets and years of preparation. Not one of them was saying, have you considered just asking nicely? The waste reclamation port was located on the ship's lower aft section, a region so unglamorous that it didn't even appear in the promotional materials the Viridian Empire distributed. The port's hangar was automated, staffed by mechanical systems that grabbed incoming pods, processed their contents, and sent them back out without any biological oversight. Why would you waste personnel on watching garbage? The pod docked with a gentle thud that Gage felt through the wall. Magnetic clamps engaged. The external airlock cycled. For a moment nothing happened, and Gage wondered if perhaps this was where the plan would collapse. Some unexpected inspection, some random check that would find a human hiding among the waste containers. Then the internal doors opened, and the pod was pulled into the processing bay by mechanical arms that had all the curiosity of toasters. The arms positioned the pod, began their automated scanning sequence, and found exactly what they expected: waste containers ready for removal and process. What they didn't find, because they weren't programmed to look for it, was the human slipping out through a maintenance hatch on the pod's underside, dropping 3 meters to the deck plating, and rolling into the shadow of a processing tank before the bay's motion sensors could register anything unusual. Gage lay still for 10 seconds, 20, waiting for alarms that didn't sound. The processing bay continued its mechanical routine, unaware that it had just admitted an intruder. The Eternal Dominion's legendary security had been breached by someone hiding in the trash. Standing slowly, Gage pulled out a handheld scanner and began mapping the immediate area. The ship's interior layout was classified, obviously,
But ships this size followed predictable patterns. Life support conduits had to run everywhere, maintenance access had to exist, and maintenance access, by definition, meant paths through the ship that security assumed nobody would use because they were uncomfortable, indirect and required actually working for your infiltration. Perfect. The first maintenance hatch was exactly where basic engineering logic said it should be, tucked behind a waste processing tank and marked with Yaveridian symbols that translated roughly to authorized personnel only, which was adorable. Gage popped the hatch with a bypass tool, squeezed into a tunnel barely wide enough for human shoulders, and began crawling deeper into the most secure ship in the galaxy. Behind, in the processing bay, the waste pod completed its scheduled task and was ejected back into space, its transponder cheerfully reporting a successful collection. The automated systems logged the transaction as routine. The security network noted nothing unusual. And somewhere in the ship's vast interior, past shield arrays and weapons systems and thousands of guards, the Emperor slept in his chambers, completely unaware that someone was crawling through his ship's intestines with a head full of bad ideas and just enough competence to make them work.
The maintenance tunnels of the Eternal Dominion were not designed with comfort in mind, which made sense because they were designed for maintenance drones approximately 1/3 the size of a human. Gage had been crawling for 40 minutes, and several body parts were filing formal complaints with management. Management was ignoring them, because management had made a bet and had a reputation for following through on spectacularly stupid decisions. The tunnel network was a three-dimensional maze of conduits, access shafts, and junction points that serviced the ship's various systems. Gage's scanner painted a rough map of the surrounding infrastructure, cross-referenced with stolen deck plans that were 17 years out of date and possibly fictional. The good news was that ships this size couldn't be completely reconfigured. The basic structural elements had to stay where physics demanded they stay. The bad news was that roughly correct still left plenty of room for getting catastrophically lost inside 47 kilometers of military vessel. At Junction Point 7, Gage emerged into a larger maintenance hub where a crew of actual Yaveridian technicians were conducting repairs on a plasma relay. This was the sort of complication that proper planning was supposed to avoid. Except proper planning was for people who thought things through. And thinking things through was what got you stuck in analysis paralysis instead of halfway through an impossible infiltration. The technicians were engrossed in their work, arguing about calibration settings in the way technicians everywhere argued about calibration settings with passion, technical jargon, and absolutely no awareness of their surrounding. Gage waited until their argument reached peak intensity, then simply walked past them wearing a maintenance vest that had been inside the waste pod. The vest was the wrong color, the wrong style, and didn't have any proper identification tag. It also didn't matter, because people saw what they expected to see, and what they expected to see in a maintenance hub was maintenance personnel. One technician glanced up mid-argument, made eye contact with Gage, and returned to explaining why the plasma frequency was clearly 0.73, and not 0.74. Gage nodded sympathetically, because honestly, 0.74 did sound wrong, and continued toward the far exit. 3 decks up, the maintenance tunnels gave way to actual corridors, which meant entering spaces where people might ask questions. The solution was timing, and confidence. Gage waited until a shift change began, when corridors filled with personnel moving between duty stations, then merged into the flow. The uniform was still wrong, but wrong in a generic way that suggested different department rather than intrusion. Half the personnel on a ship this size didn't know what the other half's uniforms looked like anyway. A passing officer, identifiable by the excessive ornamentation on their uniform, gave Gage a quizzical look. Gage responded by checking a datapad, frowning and walking faster, the universal body language for "I'm late for something important, and don't have time for your question." The officer let them pass because questioning a harried maintenance worker was how you ended up in a 20-minute conversation about problems you couldn't solve and didn't understand. The Emperor's personal quarters occupied the ship's most protected section, naturally. Getting there required passing through 6 security checkpoints, each more paranoid than the last. The first checkpoint was guarded by automated systems that scanned for weapons and unauthorized implants. Gage passed through carrying nothing more threatening than a maintenance scanner and a multi-tool, both of which were exactly what a technician should carry. The systems beeped green. The second checkpoint involved actual guards, 2 Yaveridian soldiers, whose job was to stand there looking imposing while checking credentials. Gage presented a forged work order for environmental system maintenance, priority 3, which was boring enough to be believable and low priority enough not to warrant additional scrutiny. The guards scanned the work order, verified it against their daily log, and waved Gage through because arguing about maintenance schedules was someone else's problem. Checkpoint 3 was where things got interesting. Biometric scanning, the kind that mapped your entire genetic signature and compared it against approved personnel. This was where the infiltration should have ended, where perfect security should have caught the intruder and initiated lockdown protocol. It would have been a great story about flawless defenses, except for one small detail. The Uveridian Empire had never encountered humans before joining the Galactic community. Their biometric database had human genetic markers, sure, but only baseline standard reference. It didn't have the variations, the mutations, the sheer weird diversity that humanity crammed into its genome. Gage's genetic signature registered as unknown biological anomaly, which could mean anything from a new species to a database error. The system flagged it for review. The review process involved alerting a supervisor, who was currently dealing with 73 other minor alerts, because the Eternal Dominion's security system was so sensitive it flagged dust particles. The supervisor, demonstrating the kind of discretion that comes from alert fatigue, marked it as probable database corruption, and cleared the flag. Gage walked through while the system was still processing the override. Checkpoint 4, quantum-locked doors, that only opened for specific harmonic frequencies, generated by authorized access cards. Gage didn't have an authorized access card. Gage had a maintenance scanner that could generate white noise across a broad frequency spectrum. It took 6 minutes of cycling through frequencies, during which any passing patrol would have immediately identified the intrusion attempt. No patrols passed. The corridor was empty because it was between shift rotations, a 30-minute window when personnel levels dropped due to nothing more complicated than bureaucratic scheduling. The door opened on attempt 240. Checkpoint 5 was psychological, a corridor so opulent, so clearly designated for high-status individuals, that anyone unauthorized would automatically feel out of place and leave. The walls were decorated with living crystal formations from Viridian Prime's polar regions, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. The floor was actual marble, imported from a planet that had been dead for 6,000 years. Walking through it felt like trespassing in a museum. Gage walked through it eating a ration bar, because psychological intimidation only worked if you respected it, and respecting things was for people who weren't currently pulling off impossible heists. The sixth and final checkpoint was the Emperor's personal guard, 2 elite soldiers in powered armor carrying weapons that could punch through starship hull. They stood outside ornate doors that led to the Imperial chambers, alert and professional, and completely immune to any conventional infiltration technique. Gage studied them from around a corner, running calculations, direct approach, certain, stealth approach impossible. They had motion sensors, technical bypass. The doors behind them were probably secured beyond anything a maintenance scanner could crack. This was the point where the plan hit its limits, where perfect security actually worked, where the impossible remained impossible, which meant it was time for the backup plan, which wasn't really a plan so much as an act of inspired desperation. Gage triggered the fire suppression system, not in the Imperial corridor. That would have been too obvious. 3 decks down, in a storage area that maintenance records showed contained cleaning supplies. The chemical sensors detected the fire, and the ship's automated response kicked in. Alarms sounded, bulkhead doors, and critically, emergency protocols required all available security personnel to respond to potential fire threats, because fires on spacecraft were existential nightmares that killed everyone aboard. The 2 guards hesitated. Their standing orders were to never leave their post, but their emergency training said fire trumped everything. For 5 seconds they stood frozen between conflicting imperatives, before one of them made a command decision, and they both ran toward the emergency, because protocols were protocols and fires were fire. Gage gave them a 10-second head start, then approached the doors. They were locked, obviously, with encryption that would take years to crack. They were also equipped with manual overrides for emergency evacuation, because safety regulations required it, and safety regulations didn't care about security theater. The override panel was behind a decorative crystal panel, The crystal panel was priceless. Gage broke it with the multi-tool and activated the override, which was designed for use during catastrophic emergencies, and didn't require authorization, because authorization systems might be offline during catastrophic emergencies. The doors opened. The Emperor's personal chambers were exactly as absurd as expected, a vast space decorated with treasures from 1,000 worlds. Artwork that civilizations had gone to war over, and furniture that cost more than most planetary economy. In the center, on a bed that could have comfortably slept 20 people, the Emperor himself was sitting up, alerted by the alarms, wearing sleeping robes that had more precious metals woven into them than most currency reserves. He stared at Gage. Gage stared. "Maintenance," Gage said, holding up the scanner. The Emperor reached for an alert button. Gage crossed the room in 4 running steps, and placed a small device on the Emperor's nightstand, a human data storage unit, the kind used for personal photos and messages. It was loaded with a single file, a picture of Gage giving a thumbs up in front of the Eternal Dominion's promotional materials, timestamped to 3 hours ago. "Just needed to leave a calling card," Gage said. "Your security's actually pretty good. You should fire whoever designed the maintenance access protocols though." Then Gage ran, because the guards would be returning any second, and there was a difference between successfully infiltrating and successfully surviving the infiltration. Behind, the Emperor hit the alert button. Every alarm on the ship began screaming. Thousands of guards mobilized. The greatest security apparatus in the galaxy activated in full lockdown mode. And somewhere in the maintenance tunnels, a human was crawling back toward the waste processing bay, laughing like an idiot, because the impossible had just become the improbable, and the improbable was basically Tuesday for humanity. The Eternal Dominion in full lockdown was a sight to behold, assuming you had time to behold things instead of running for your life through increasingly hostile corridors. Gage did not have that time. Gage had approximately 4 minutes before every access point sealed. Every patrol converged on the Imperial section, and every sensor array focused on finding the suicidal idiot who just committed the galaxy's most audacious act of breaking and entering. The maintenance tunnels were no longer viable. They'd be flooded with security drones within minutes. The waste processing bay was too far, and even if reached, would be locked down tighter than everything else. Running out the way you came in was textbook thinking, and textbook thinking was what people expected, which meant it was exactly what not to do. Instead, Gage ran toward the hangar bay. Not the main hangar bay, obviously. That would have been defended by enough firepower to level a city. No, Gage headed for Auxiliary Hangar 7, which housed the Emperor's personal transport shuttles, and was currently experiencing a maintenance shift change. The forged work order that had gotten through Checkpoint 2 was still valid in the system, and the system was now in enough chaos that nobody was double-checking maintenance credentials when there were intruders to find. The hangar was chaos in its own right. Pilots running to their ships, ground crew scrambling to prepare emergency intercept craft, officers shouting contradictory orders. Gage walked through it wearing the maintenance vest, and an expression of focused determination, heading straight for a luxury shuttle that was probably worth more than several planets. A flight officer blocked the path. "This shuttle is restricted to Imperial family owned." "You can't." "Emperor's orders," Gage said, not slowing down. "Security breach. Need to move the backup transport to secure location." It was a terrible lie. It made no sense under scrutiny. The officer opened their mouth to argue, then registered the absolute conviction in Gage's voice and the chaos erupting around them and made a split-second decision to let it be someone else's problem. The officer stepped aside. Gage climbed into the shuttle, sealed the hatch, and discovered that luxury transports designed for emperors had security systems that required retinal scans, genetic verification, and probably a blood sacrifice to start. The cockpit controls might as well have been decorative for all the access they provided, which was fine, because Gage wasn't planning to fly the shuttle. The escape plan, in calling it a plan, was generous, relied on a specific quirk of hangar bay design. Auxiliary hangars had independent atmospheric shields that allowed ships to launch without decompressing the entire bay. Those shields were controlled by automated systems that opened when a ship's engines activated. They didn't care who activated the engines or whether the ship was cleared for departure. They just reacted to engine ignition. Gage couldn't start the shuttle's main engine, but the shuttle had maneuvering thrusters for fine control,
and those ran on a separate system with fewer security restrictions, because they were low power and couldn't actually propel the ship anywhere dangerous. Except, not dangerous, assumed you were using them correctly. Gage fired all maneuvering thrusters, simultaneously at maximum burn. The shuttle lurched sideways, slamming into the hangar deck with a screech of metal that made several technicians dive for cover. The atmospheric shield detected engine activity and the shuttle, pushed by thrust it was never meant to use this way, skidded across the hangar floor and tumbled out into space like a thrown brick. Inside, Gage was thrown against the safety restraints hard enough to bruise ribs. The shuttle spun wildly, all its careful engineering reduced to a tumbling piece of expensive debris. The maneuvering thrusters sputtered out, fuel exhausted. The shuttle continued its momentum through the shield, through the Eternal Dominion's outer perimeter, and into open space. Behind it, the hangar bay erupted into further chaos. The point defense network tracked the shuttle, weapons charging, before identification protocols screamed that it was an Imperial transport, and absolutely not a valid target. The weapons held fire. Guard ships launched in pursuit instead, because capturing a stolen Imperial shuttle was going to look much better on the incident report than vaporizing it. Gage didn't wait for them to get close. The shuttle's emergency beacon was already transmitting, standard protocol for any craft in distress. That beacon was being picked up by every ship in the area, including a particular waste management pod that had been programmed to loiter nearby for exactly this contingent. The waste pod adjusted course, matching velocity with the tumbling shuttle. It extended a magnetic grapple, the kind designed for capturing and securing garbage containers. The grapple locked onto the shuttle's hull, and then the pod's engines, which were significantly more functional than they appeared, fired at full thrust, dragging both vessels away from the Eternal Dominion, at a velocity that civilian waste management craft absolutely should not have been capable of achieving. The guard ships pursued, but they were cautious about firing on what their sensors still identified as an Imperial shuttle. That caution cost them precious seconds. By the time command authorization came through to disable the shuttle with targeted EMP bursts, Gage had already transferred back to the waste pod through an umbilical connection, sealed the hatch and detached. The shuttle continued on its trajectory, a decoy. The waste pod altered course, its modified engines pushing it into a debris field that scattered sensor return. The guard ships split their pursuit, half following the shuttle, half searching the debris field for the pod that had already engaged its stealth coding and shut down all non-essential systems. Gage drifted in the debris field for 3 hours, barely breathing, while Lyridian ships prowled nearby. Eventually they expanded their search pattern, moving farther out, convinced the intruder couldn't have gotten far. They were looking for someone trying to escape quickly, with maximum thrust and obvious trajectory. They weren't looking for someone patient enough to hide in garbage. 72 hours later, Gage walked back into the fractured comet, and placed a data chip on the Draxian mercenaries' table. The bar's occupants, many of whom had written off the human as deceased, went very quiet. "That's a photo," Gage said, timestamped. Taken inside the Emperor's personal chambers. Also, there's a recording of me saying hello to his nightstand. The Emperor has the original storage device as a souvenir. The Draxian stared at the chip like it might explode. Then he played the file on a public display, because everyone in the bar needed to see this. The image showed exactly what Gage had promised, a human giving a thumbs up in front of artwork that anyone familiar with Lyridian Imperial collections would recognize as being from the Emperor's private chambers. The metadata confirmed it. The timestamp confirmed it. The sheer impossibility of it was confirmed by the fact that the entire sector was still buzzing with news about the security breach aboard the Eternal Dominion, about the Emperor's fury, about the complete lockdown of the most secure ship in known space, after someone had somehow walked into the Imperial chambers and walked back out. "You actually did it," the Havalian information broker chittered, already calculating how much she could sell this story for. "You breached the Untouchable ship." Turns out Untouchable just meant nobody had bothered to touch it properly, Gage said, collecting the 100,000 credits the Draxian transferred with shaking hands. "Security's only as good as the people implementing it, and people are really bad at imagining how stupid someone might be willing to act." The bar erupted into conversation, into arguments about how it was possible, into demands for detail. Gage provided a few, carefully edited to remove any techniques worth repeating, because there was a difference between being famous and being hunted. Word spread, as word does. The human who breached the eternal dominion. The infiltrator who turned the galaxy's greatest security into a punchline. Job offers flooded in from parties both legitimate and otherwise, all wanting the person who'd proven that nothing was truly untouchable. 3 weeks later, Gage sat in the same corner booth, reviewing those offers with mild interest. Most were boring. High-security facilities, corporate espionage, military installations, all very professional, very planned, very predictable. Then one caught attention. A challenge, not a job offer. The collective mind of Hexera 9, the same hive intelligence that had designed the Eternal Dominion's security, wanted to hire Gage to test their new installation. A research facility they claimed had learned from the Emperor's humiliation. Something they said was actually impossible to breach, now that they'd accounted for human thinking. Gage smiled, the same smile that had preceded the last impossible task. The smile that suggested either supreme confidence or absolutely no survival instinct whatsoever. Challenge accepted, Gage said to the empty air. Already planning, because the thing about proving something impossible was actually possible, was that you just painted a target on everything else claiming to be impossible. And somewhere in the galaxy, security designers were having nightmares about garbage pods and maintenance protocols, while one human with too much confidence and not enough sense was looking for the next untouchable thing to touch. The Eternal Dominion would update its security. They'd patch the vulnerabilities, add new protocols, train their guards to expect the unexpected. They'd spend fortunes making sure it never happened again, and somewhere eventually someone would call it untouchable again, which was when things would get really interesting.